Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us from all over the world for our event, Forugh Farrokhzad, Iconic Iranian Poet. My name is Negar Siari. I'm a PhD candidate in linguistics at Georgetown University and a teaching assistant in the Persian Studies program. If at any time you'd like to pose a question for us, please use the Q&A box on Zoom so you can ask your questions from our panelists. As always, questions are welcome in English, Finglish, and Farsi. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing the founder and director of the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University, Professor Farzaneh Milani.
خانم ها و آقایان سلام. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Persian Studies program of Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to Forugh Farrokhzad, Iconic Iranian Poet, our 13th Jalinus lecture series in the form of a webinar. We really appreciate your presence today and your interest in our cultural events. We are planning to have one more event in December that you will receive soon the information. Let me also extend my gratitude to Shahrzad and Farhad Jalinus, that without their help, these cultural events would not have taken place. Now I am pleased to present you our panelists, Dr. Farzaneh Milani and Mrs. Tara Kangarloo. Tara Kangarloo is an award-winning Iranian-American journalist who has previously worked with news outlets such as NBC, CNN, CNN International, and Al Jazeera America. She has spent much time covering the rise and fall of ISIS and the conflicts in Syria and Iraq. She founded Art of Hope, the first American nonprofit that strictly focuses on supporting the mental well-being of war-torn refugees and IDPs in vulnerable host communities. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Heartbeat of Iran, that provides insight into the many nuances and complexities of life in today's Iran, as told through the stories of ordinary Iranians living inside the country. She is currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, teaching at the intersection of journalism and public diplomacy. I turn to you, dear Mrs. Kangarloo, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all. من هم به نوبه خودم به همه عزیزانی که از اقصا نقاط دنیا به تماشای این وبینار اومدن تشکر میکنم و سلام عرض میکنم. I also want to extend my thanks to the Persian Studies Department at Georgetown, and a very special thanks to Dr. Farzaneh Milani for having me and for this introduction. It is such an honor to be moderating this very powerful and also timely topic and this cultural icon and literary figure of Persian literature, Forugh Farrokhzad, and we will get into the conversation and we hopefully will touch on the many aspects of this phenomenon woman's life. But before, it is my absolute honor and privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Farzaneh Milani, who is the Raymond J. Nelson Professor of Iranian Literature and Gender Studies at the University of Virginia. She's the former chair of the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures and past director of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Middle East Studies program. Dr. Milani has also published several books and articles in Persian and English. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, Ms. Magazine, and many more publications in the US and around the world. Now, She has presented more than 270 lectures nationally and internationally. A past president of the Association of Middle Eastern Women's Study in America and a Carnegie Fellow, Dr. Milani was the recipient of the All-University Teaching Award in 1999, Zintl Leadership Award in 2015, and Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Award and Professorship in 2020. Now, the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy invited Dr. Milani to join them as a member of its board of external experts for literature in 2021, so just this past year. And Dr. Milani will serve in the capacity for 3 years. It is, again, a privilege to be in conversation with you, Dr. Milani, especially at this critical time, as so many eyes are on Iran, but particularly its women and girls. And we will get to that. With that, I will let you take it from here and start the conversation.
Dr. Milani, we can't hear you. If you can unmute yourself on Zoom, that would be amazing. Thank you, everyone, for your patience as we are trying to figure out some technical issues. Okay, perfect. You are unmuted. Thank you.
Well, let me repeat what I said. I thank Tarajun for this most generous introduction. It's going to be an honor to share the podium and to be in conversation with a prize-winning author, with a world-renowned journalist, and of course, an activist. And I love the name of your organization, The Art of Hope. I also want to thank a dear friend, someone I've known for the last 20 years, Professor Mostofi. Thank you. I'm grateful for the invitation. And I'm really proud of the amazing team you're working with. In particular, today, I would like to thank Negarjun, who is helping us with the technology. Of course, I'm also grateful to the Jolly News family for supporting Iranian studies, Iranian arts. I hope by the end of this conversation, you will be convinced that art can be a savior for us all. Before I begin, I would like to salute the young women and men in Iran who are fighting violence with empty hands, awe-inspiring courage, and life-affirming words. And my greetings to the students who are here in this virtual room. As recent events in my country of birth, Iran, and the institution I love and have served for almost 40 years, that is the University of Virginia, make abundantly clear, we live in a violent world. But as long as there are students like you and like the students in Iran, I will not lose hope and optimism. So my friends, lead us to the shore of justice and peace. Take us to the lighthouse of truth and beauty. Lead us to a non-violent world for all. The glorious revolution we are witnessing in the streets of Iran has been long in the making. This renaissance, this rebirth, this rejection of violence, segregation, silence, and invisibility is a revolution of values. It is shifting age-old hierarchies of power. It is redefining masculinity and femininity in millions of homes, in kitchens and bedrooms, in hearts and minds. No regime, no government can stop it. No regime, no government can put it behind bars or strangle it. Successive generations of Iranians have risked life and limb for this bloodless revolution. I believe women writers and poets have been at the forefront of this third revolution. In the clairvoyant words of Forugh Farrokhzad, who titled her fourth poetry collection Rebirth, and was banned for years after the 1979 revolution, and is still censored in more ways than one in her country. This is not about fearful whispers in the dark. It's about light and open windows and fresh air. It's about everything useless burning in fire. It's about a field pregnant with a new crop. It's about a rebirth. Now, a few words about Forugh Farrokhzad, who entered my life and became my lifetime companion one hot summer evening in 1963. I vividly recall that defining moment in my future scholarly life. The smell of jasmine was everywhere, and the beautiful star-studded sky of Tehran was almost within my reach. And suddenly, indelible images of children, women, and men disfigured by leprosy filled the television screen. At first, I could hardly look at these heart-wrenching images, but soon I was drawn in, unable to look away. The veil of disease was cast aside, and dignified people emerged from beneath twisted flesh and rotting bones. As I watched the 22-minute documentary titled "The House is Black," I was jolted by its magnetism, by its search for beauty, by its verbal and visual poetry, by its unpretentious humanity and boundless compassion. I could not easily forget this film, and I did not. From then on, Farrokhzad's work became a permanent fixture in my life. Although my reading of Farrokhzad's poetry has changed over the years, I would like to share with you why she continues to have such an impact on me, and I believe on many Iranians like me, and why I continue to have such reverence for her work. I admire Farrokhzad not because she was a perfect poet or a perfect human being, but because she was the first one to admit that she was flawed and fallible. She called herself in her poetry a sinner, a disloyal wife, an unworthy mother, an infamous fool, even a self-confessed harlot. As a woman, though, she took full responsibility for her actions and desires. Her focus on denied rights was complemented by her insistence on personal responsibilities. It is this unabashed belief in the agency of every single person that prevented her from portraying women in general, or herself in particular, as perennial victims. These were fundamental to her poetry. They were fundamental to who she wanted to become. Farrokhzad also knew the world is far from a perfect place. Still, she wanted to become a better version of herself and make the world a better place. She owned her mistakes, learned from them, and moved on. She wanted to change and to grow, no matter how inconvenient or how exorbitant the price. She wanted to recreate herself. And as we all know, she did so with uncommon discipline and daring. Two, Farrokhzad was a seeker after truth, beauty, and authenticity. She used every platform she had, and she had many: poetry, short stories, film, several interviews, several articles, and many letters to criticize opacity and dishonesty. Truth mattered to her. She wanted to seek it, to see it, to tell it, to demand it, to hear it. She believed telling the truth was her duty, and hearing the truth was the right of her interlocutors. This truth-telling project is the driving narrative of her life and work. I cannot lie, she repeated over and over again. And these were not empty words. She did tell the truth, regardless of consequences and repercussions. And let me repeat, we all know she paid a high price for them. She refused to lie by omission. She refused to defy cultural, literary, and cinematic taboos. She did not fearfully whisper in the dark. She did not hide behind falsehoods or indirections, nor did she keep ancestral silences. For her, poetry was daylight, open windows, and fresh air. For her, as for John Keats, truth was beauty, and beauty was truth. 3. Farrokhzad refused to stay in assigned spaces and roles. She challenged monolithic and static identities and insisted on being simultaneously a poet, a cinematographer, a painter, an actor, as well as a daughter, sister, wife, lover, biological, and adoptive mother. Although the concept of motherhood was fundamental to her life and art, she believed in it as a choice, not as an obligation or as an institution. She wanted to combine motherhood with the pursuit of art. She wanted to be a great poet and a loving mother at the same time. And this should be the right of every woman who wants it. Farrokhzad suffered from the forced separation from her biological son, and her son, Kamiar Shapur, suffered no less. This excruciating separation of mother and son for the last 10 years of Farrokhzad's life caused her great agony and was alchemized into poetry. It is hard to read a poem like Vahm Sab's The Green Terror and not cry with the mother who is still crying to her mirror decades later. A loving mother who is lamenting her cruel treatment as an ex-mother. 4. Farrokhzad rejected sex segregation and exclusion. This young woman, who died at the age of 32, claimed her rightful place in the world. She wanted to be heard. She wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged. She wanted to be recognized as a real flesh and blood woman. She wanted to be celebrated as a great poet that she was, and the great cinematographer that we know she was. Why do you keep me always in the deep of the sea? She asked in the title poem of Let Us Believe in the Dawn of the Cold Season. Why do you always keep me in the deep of the sea? I feel cold. I feel cold. And I despise these mother of pearl earrings. It is this violence of erasure that Farrokhzad aimed to overcome with her boundary pushing work. It was this imposed silence that would force women to recede in the dark that she rejected. This insistence that her full-fledged humanity and human dignity and human rights be asserted and acknowledged. That was indeed an existential struggle and fight for her. Having experienced systems of exclusion and confinement, Farrokhzad understood her country's dark and long history of gender apartheid and its impact on gender relations, on women and men, young and old, rich and poor. As a desegregationist, she demanded visibility, voice, and mobility in a tenacious and distinctive style. 5. Farrokhzad interrogated dualism and binary opposites. She refused to draw walls of separation between us and them, here and there, insider and outsider, male and female, beautiful and ugly, healthy and sick. She knew these categories are based upon exclusion and injustice, power imbalance and domination, cruelty and lack of love and compassion. That's why in the literary architecture of her work, thresholds have a significant role. I will come, I will come, I will come. And the threshold will be filled with love. And there at the threshold, I will greet all those who love. And I will greet the girl who stands at the threshold and is filled with love. Threshold is a twilight zone. It's an in-between territory, a space in which opposites coexist, a space in which the world is not reduced to black or white, right or wrong, captivity or freedom. To the contrary, it's a world that portrays right and wrong, captivity and freedom, black and white. It's a third space, a space in which thinking in terms of the conjunction and rather than or is allowed. It offers a spectrum of options and opinions rather than two conflicting extremes. It offers a space where the exchange of ideas is possible, dialogical thinking is fostered, and creativity blossoms. And finally, I still love the work of Forugh Farrokhzad because of the gateless horizon it offers me, because it gives me shelter and refuge and wings to fly with, because it takes me to places in which I have left my childhood behind, to places that continue to be in my dreams, to the setting of my earliest and most profound memories, a place in which my parents and my ancestors are buried. I love her work because it offers me a surrogate home, a portable country, a country that has never refused me safe entry and safe exit, because it has become my perennial garden. I have put down roots in it and turned it into a place to grow in, to find my voice in, to plant my ideas in. Every time I stand at the threshold of this work, every time I open its gate, a familiar scent floats out of it, a scent of home, a scent of effortless belonging, a scent of jasmine and the star-studded sky of my childhood in Iran. Salman Rushdie argued that the books and stories we fall in love with make us who we are. I hope I have been changed by Farrokhzad's work. I hope I see the world, myself, and others with a pair of new eyes, that I challenge what I took for granted because of habit, conventions, or expectations. I hope this literary journey has helped me dust off the mirror of my soul, open the gates of my heart and mind and soul to curiosity and compassion, to higher ideas and ideals. I hope it has helped me wash my gaze, cleanse my words, stretch my world, and remain a seeker after truth and beauty, after poetry, after knowledge and enlightenment, after love, justice, freedom, and nonviolence for all, in particular, those who are fighting for women, life, and liberation in my country of birth, Iran. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Milani, for that really rich, comprehensive, yet truly poetic introduction of this timeless poet. And I have to say, I think perhaps so many women, Iranian women, may all remember the first time they picked their book of Forough or saw her documentary, and that's one of the many effects of her words, her work, but also emotional truth, and that's something that we are going to get into. Now, I have a lot of questions, and I know the audience has as well, but for those who may not be as familiar with Forugh Farrokhzad, I just want to briefly put it into context, especially for our non-Iranian viewers. I just want to say that Forugh was born 5 years before the start of the Second World War, and this is a woman who was born just 14 years after 1920s, when women's voting right was just ratified here in the United States. So that's just to give you a sense of the time this woman was living in and the time that she grew up in. And that takes me to my first question. She was in many ways redefining the meanings of religion, morals, love, honor, kindness, pain, fear, as you mentioned. But in relation to the circumstances of her time. I wonder, how does her poetry do that? How does her poetry push these boundaries? And that takes me to the second point that I want to raise, which is, I remember reading Forugh as a teenager in Iran. I was born and raised in Iran until my late teens, and Forugh was a companion of mine. And even today, I have two books on my bedside. One of them is Forugh's and the other one is of Sohrab Sepehri. And they too allow me to travel back to my homeland. And I remember, this is in late 90s and early 2000s Iran, her voice, her tenacity of pushing boundaries and questioning her surrounding and quest for breaking away and freedom was something I felt in her words. And I will say with confidence that today inside our country, our place of birth, there's so many Iranian women and girls whose courage in many ways mirror and resonate with that of Forugh. So I'd like for you to tell us a bit more specifically on the tenacity and timeless nature of Forugh that shows the many challenges that women faced prior to her being born, in the many years past, but also its timeless nature as of today. How is it that women today in Iran connect with this woman who came of age in the 50s and 60s, who happens to reflect so many challenges of women who came before her?
Thank you, Sarah Jan. That's a great question. And thank you for contextualizing her life within a global context. So please allow me to follow your lead and offer a few minutes of context for her unique poetry, not only within Iranian literature, but I believe in the global context. You mentioned World War II, you mentioned some rights that women gained in the Western world. I want to bring to your kind attention the fact that although it has rarely or occasionally or not as much as it should be acknowledged in the world, and here I'm reminded of the amazing opening lines of this fabulous book, Invisible Man, in which Ralph Ellison says, "I'm invisible," and I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me if it's not the exact quotation. "I'm invisible, listen, because you refuse to see me." Iranian women have been fighting for democracy, for human rights, for human dignity, for desegregation since 1848. In fact, if we take the Seneca Falls Convention, which happened in 1848 in upstate New York, in Seneca Falls, as a watershed moment in women's rights in the world, a week before it, we had a woman, a religious scholar, but also a poet who unveiled herself publicly and desegregated not only her unveiled face, but also her voice. And since then, women in Iran have been included, have been fighting for their rights. 1890s tobacco movement, 1905, 1911 constitutional revolution, the 1953 coup d'etat, the 1979 Islamic revolution, and the last 40-some years, they have been the only group that have been relentless in demanding their rights and their human dignity. So we have to place Forugh Farrokhzad in the context of a glorious literary tradition. Having said that, I also believe Forugh was ahead of her times. She was a woman with impeccable courage, audacity, insight. She was a woman who was willing to pay the price for the things she wanted. And she has said that repeatedly. If you take the combination of the things that I enumerated, the fact that she believed in telling the truth, the fact that she believed it's the right of a woman to have freedom of expression, to love and to be loved the way she wants to be. Her fight for freedom of movement. I mean, if you look at her poetry, the desire to be constantly on the move, to grow, to go places, is central to her poetry. If we keep all of these different desires and wishes of her, and add to her courage to accept responsibility for every single one of them, which allowed her to grow by leaps and bounds, then we understand why she's had this amazing impact on Iranian literature, on Iranian history, on the men and women who are bravely struggling for human rights and human dignity in Iran.
Absolutely, and that takes me to the point that I want to make, which I really hope you can elaborate on, Dr. Milani, and that is, again, in the spirit of contextualizing, Forugh Farrokhzad was living during the Pahlavi era, at a time where freedom of press and freedom of voice was also censored in its own way. Press freedom was censored in different shapes and different ways before the revolution and after. And she was not popular during that time amongst many conservative and traditional circles. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that's important as we talk about this figure who was not welcomed in many ways by the politicians and the patriarchy that in many ways governed the time. And also after the revolution, as you mentioned, her book was also banned. So she was a threat both before and after. And to our initial point, that reflects the tenacity of Iranian women throughout history who wanted to break away from societal, religious, political, and traditional confinements that quite essentially, quite frankly, played as a didactic force in their life. Can you tell us a bit about her life during that time, trying to find the freedoms that prevented her to be seen by the masses and the public as she deserved, really?
Tarajan, this is a great question and a complicated one. One that I will do my best to answer, but that really needs a lot of unpacking. But let me rely on her own work to answer your very important question. What at this age I appreciate the most in Farrokhzad's poetry is that even though at times, because of her life circumstances, it shuttles back and forth between joy and sadness, between some of the most beautiful love rhapsodies that we have in all of Iranian literature. And then sentences like, "All my wounds are from love, from love, from love." Between her desire to and her success in unveiling for the first time a male lover in Iranian literature. We've had fantastic gender relationships, lover in Iran, but they were all produced by the pen of men. in Forough Farrokhzad's poetry, for the first time, a man as a lover is unveiled. The poet, that beautiful poem, Fath Baq, Garden Conquest, or the Conquest of the Garden, which is a recreation of the Garden of Eden, is a wonderful example of how she goes to the very beginning of creation to create a new man and a new woman, a new man capable of loving and being loved, a man capable of showing emotions, a man for whom a woman is an equal, not a zaife, the weak one, or any of these other adjectives we have. But what Farrokhzad has taught me is that the world is not black or white, right or wrong, censorship or no censorship. Sure, Farrokhzad was also censored, in all likelihood, mainly by her internalized censorship. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know of a single poem of hers that did not get published the way she wanted it to be published. Her poems today in Iran, a lot more than half a century after her death, are still censored. Words, sentences, lines are deleted from them. I don't know of any poem that was published during her lifetime. And since you referred to the Pahlavi regime, during the Pahlavi regime. Now we know censorship is a very complicated issue. We internalize censorship, and Farrokhzad was as honest, as open as she could be in her poetry. And for a moment, consider what she has written about and what is happening in our country today. She wrote about numerous relationships with different men. She talked about being a sinner, a crime for which she could have been stoned to death now. She wrote about an amazing love relationship with a married man. I'm not judging. I'm not talking about anything other than none of these would have been allowed in the last 44 years in Iran. So what I'm trying to say, that the important thing is to keep in mind that we should not talk about total censorship or total lack of censorship. These are a process, and it is the degree of censorship that makes all the difference.
Absolutely. And I do wonder, quickly, a follow-up to that, just briefly, your thoughts on this. Do you think she was seen as a threat to the cultural and sort of traditional norms then, perhaps? Do you think it was more that then, rather than, you know, her work being censored, or, you know,
Persian, you're
for lack of a better word, yeah. Go ahead.
You're absolutely right. She was considered a threat. And I have to say, almost every woman writer and poet in the last 170 years, and I begin the tradition of women writers in Iran with Tahireh Qurratul Ain, I believe in that. Those who have written about a different kind of gender relation, about desegregation, about women and men being equal partners, have always been considered a threat. Even today, if you check the collection of poems published now, that presumably she's not banned anymore in Iran, and compare it to the first editions published in pre-revolutionary Iran, you will find something fascinating, Tarajun. Generally speaking, all the lines or the poems or the paragraphs in which she challenges traditional definition of a family as man, as the patriarch, in full support of the family, as women being inside the house, voiceless, powerless, immobilized, are the ones that have been cut. Let's not forget that before the ratification of a constitution in Iran, after the revolution, the first law that was rescinded in Iran was the family law of 1967.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely, and I think really that's one of the underlying reasons as to why so many women and girls right now in Iran resonate with this woman and connect with her words, because they are living in utmost confinement. And as you and I have talked before, Iranian women have shown throughout history that they are not victims, but survivors, and they keep pushing and pushing, and their tenacity and courage is something that is a force for change and keeps them going. And I think that's commendable and something very different in other countries and regions. Now, I want to move on, if that's okay, to her family. She had a very interesting childhood. She got married at the age of 16. She got divorced when she was 20, if I'm not mistaken, and that was, in the 50s. Could you tell us a bit about her childhood? Her father, from what I've read and know, was quite a strict military man, and he was very absolute in his ways, and this rebellious nature perhaps stems from that, from observing her surroundings as a child, and later was manifested in her marriage. Could you tell us a bit about her childhood and her marriage and the impact it had on Forough's rebellious and tenacious spirit?
Sure. Forough was the third child in a family of 7. Her mother, Turan Khanum, with whom I had the great honor to have many conversations, who was truly an unusual woman in her own right, was as honest and as frank as a woman of her generation I've ever met. I have met many of Forough's sisters and brothers. They had a difficult childhood. And there is a lot more that we need to learn about her childhood. We know, for instance, that Forough attempted suicide as a young girl, as a teenager, before she got married to Mr. Parviz Shahpour. Now, Mr. Shahpour was her neighbor, but also a family member. He was a storyteller. And even from that early relationship, we can tell that Forugh was desperate, was looking for ways to go beyond the confines that restricted her. That I'm not saying that's the only reason she married Mr. Shapur. It was a marriage of love. It was a marriage that was vehemently opposed by both families. But both of them wanted the marriage, and they did get married. The letters that Forugh Farrokhzad wrote to her husband, her future husband, have been published thanks to the kindness, I would say, of her biological son, Cavaliers Shapur, before his early death, published these letters, although they have been censored. And there are sections of it that I think are some of the most important sections deleted. But still, that book called Tapishhay Dil Ashiq Man, the beats of my loving heart, is truly eye-opening in the sense of why Forugh wanted to get married so young. She's very open about it. She just needs to get out of the house. And we know she did that. They went to, husband and wife, went to Ahvaz. They had a son, Cavaliers Shapur. But after about 4.5, 5 years, the relationship ended in divorce. Forugh was denied even sporadic visitation rights to her one and only biological son. But when she went to Baba Baqi Leprosarium and lived there for 12 days, she adopted a son, Mr. Hossein Mansouri, who is a scholar, a translator, a fantastic human being who has done a lot for his adoptive mother, has translated some of her poems. And for years, she's been promising me to write his autobiography and his relationship with his mother. I'm still waiting for that book. I hope I answered your question.
Absolutely. Again, this is one of those conversations that can go on for hours and hours, and I have so many follow-ups, and I want to get into the details. But speaking of leprosy, one of the many traits that has always stayed with me about Forugh and her poetry and work is her immense and authentic sense of empathy, Dr. Milani. And this empathy, I think, was very evident in her work, in her documentary about those suffering from leprosy. In fact, this is an issue near and dear to my heart because my own father, who was a physician, was very involved in supporting this community at a time that perhaps not much attention was given to this community, not much support was there. And I want you to tell us a little bit about that, put it a bit in historical context. Why did Forugh go to this center? Why did Forugh care? I mean, of course she cared. We all saw that and we know that. But how did that manifest in her work? And what does that tell us about Forugh as a person as well?
The film, The House is Black, was commissioned. Dr. Raji, who was directing the Association for Leprosy in Iran, approached Mr. Ibrahim Gulistan and asked him to make a movie. They wanted to raise money and to raise awareness about these innocent sinners. who were ostracized from the society. Forugh was dispatched to make a movie. She decided very early on that the only way she can make a movie about this shunned disease, about these patients who have been literally imprisoned, not because of any fault of their own, that she needed to live there, to experience their lives, but more importantly, to gain the trust of the patients who lived in that leprosarium. Tarajan, I have interviewed over 80 people for my biography of Forough Farrokhzad. I have had the great privilege to talk for days with some of her most, for some of her closest friends, lovers, family members, colleagues. I have talked for over almost 2 decades with Mr. Ibrahim Golestan, who was very open and very generous with me, who ultimately trusted me with 15 letters that had never been published before. And I've learned a lot from every single one of these interviews. And I can tell you, I traveled anywhere in the world to interview any of these people who were willing to talk to me. 2 people from the leprosarium that I've interviewed helped me the most, in a way, to answer the question you just asked me. One of them, this vivacious, brilliant woman who first was refusing to be interviewed by me, who kept saying, I don't have anything to offer you. I mean, I'm an illiterate woman. I've lived in a leprosarium for years. What can I offer you? And I begged her to grant me that interview, and she finally did. And I remember she kept telling me, Forough Khanum, Mrs. Forugh, Miss Forugh, Lady Forugh, was so kind, was so generous with us. She saw us not as patients, but as human beings. I remember her telling me she would sit at our tablecloth, sofre, and share meals with us. She said, people who came to the leprosarium, برای کار ثواب, to do something good, they were so scared of us. They never saw us as human beings. One of them said they would throw the cookies and pastries that they brought for us from fear of even getting close to us. And she said, yet this woman came and lived with us in the leprosarium for 12 days. And we know that she also adopted a son she dearly loved from that same leprosarium. Yes, there is no way that film, only 22 minutes, would be considered by many one of the best 10 documentaries ever made in the world, if it was not for the humanity, for the compassion of its director. Not only that, I also want to add that Forugh identified with these innocent sinners. Remember, even today, some people still call her the sinner poet.
Wow. As you were speaking, I couldn't help but to think of, Princess Diana and her empathy towards those suffering from HIV and AIDS, at that time, and how their empathy broke taboos, years of taboo that could not be broken except for the empathy of one woman, which is incredible and again timeless in their spirit. Now, I want to move on to the questions of our audience, but before that, I have to ask Dr. Milani, without being presumptuous, if Forough was with us today, decades after her death, what do you think she would tell the Iranian women and girls who are fighting tooth and nail for so much of what she was talking about and more? Because the situations have of course changed, as you and I know, and Iranian women are deprived from some of the most fundamental human rights. Well, what do you think women, what do you think Forough would tell the women and girls in Iran today?
Well, Tarajan, please allow me not to be presumptuous and put words in the mouth of someone I dearly admire and who is not here to share with us her thoughts. But let me tell you what I think her status will be, what those young Iranian men and women who are inspiring the world, I think, know of her. I think, in fact, I'm convinced if Forough did not die at the age of 32, she only had 13 years altogether, from the first poem that she published to the unfortunate car accident that killed her. Again, at the age of 32. She was only 32 when she produced the kind of poetry that even today, when I teach a course on Forugh Farrokhzad, it boggles the mind of my American students. It's hard for them to accept that someone who only lived such a short life, who lived in Iran, could have been talking to them with such urgency as Forough does. Two, I think what's happening in Iran, I have believed, and I still believe, in fact, I'm convinced that Iranian women writers and poets, in particular Forugh Farrokhzad, is at the forefront of this nonviolent revolution, this revolution of values, this revolution that we're witnessing, men and women holding hands, supporting each other, singing in unison, defending and being very comfortable in desegregated spaces.
Absolutely. I want to invite the audience to ask their questions. I know we have some, and we've had some before from our students. The first question I want to ask is, it kind of falls into what we just discussed, but briefly, Dr. Milani, do you think Forough would then still be considered as a feminist today? In the past, you've mentioned her desire to be seen as a humanist, and that's something we discussed, but is it correct that folks think of the word feminist as they think of her at present?
As you know, feminism is not homogeneous. There are different definitions of feminisms. And if by feminism we understand a struggle for the liberation of women and men, if by feminism we understand a struggle for a better world in which men and women can develop their potentials, if by feminism we mean the right of a woman to love, to be loved, to have a voice, to be mobile, then of course Forugh Farrokhzad was a feminist. However, as she herself reminded us, she is the first one to tell us not to confine her in any single ideology, in any single gender. She never wanted to be pigeonholed. So, when Iraj Gorgin asked her, I think one of the characteristic features of your poetry is that it is written by a woman, it's the poetry of a woman. She objected to that, and for good reason. Her poetry addresses men and women. Her poetry is about democracy, about desegregation, about human rights, about human dignity. And these things have an impact on men and women.
Absolutely. This is a very interesting question, what I'm going to ask next. And the person's asking, at the end of the wedding band, Farrokhzad discusses the implications of marriage on freedom. Now, does Forough believe that marriage is perhaps compatible with women's liberation, or is it an institution that fundamentally limits a woman's freedom? What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Milani?
Oh, that's such a fantastic question. Thank you to whoever asked that question. It's one of the early poems of Forugh Farrokhzad. It's titled Halqe Bandegi. The wedding band of bondage. So even the title is quite clear. There are two sections in the poem, if I recall it correctly. In the first section, we see a woman sitting by the window. She's full of energy and hope for the future. She's sitting by the window, which is a space of inside and outside. It's a threshold space. It's not a space of confinement. The only movement in that poem is the movement of a woman, of a girl, who can sit by the window and contemplate a future for herself, to a woman who now has a wedding band around her fingers. And when she looks at it, she says, oh my God, this is a band of bondage. This is a band of confinement and restriction. Now, this was early poetry of Forough. Later, in particular, in poems such as Fath Baq, Tavalludi Digar, on many of the poems in Tavalludi Digar and Iman Biavari به فصل سرد, به آغاز فصل سرد, the last two poetry collections, she revived her position. In Fath Baq, she says, it's not a matter of two names being united in the page, in the pages of a wedding registry. So she still was supporting relationships, wanted relationships, but she had completely redefined what a relationship should be. She rejected the traditional definitions of a family.
Absolutely, I see. And I think that takes us to our next question, which I think is another good question. And that is on gender, you know, the concept of gender and how Forough believed that both men and women suffered from the inequities of society. And this is according to the person who's asking the question. So therefore, did she see gender as a construct of oppression?
Absolutely. Absolutely. She did. She listened to the titles of her 5 poetry collection. The last one was published posthumously, and it's taken from one of her poems. Asir, captive. Divar, walls. Esyan, rebellion. Tavalludi digar, rebirth. I now think maybe we should translate it as a renaissance, because it really was a renaissance. Yes, she definitely believed gender to be a social construct. There are poems, there are letters, there are interviews in which she held some women responsible for the abysmal gender relation in Iran. Not only men, but also some women. So for her, there was a definite appreciation of gender as a social construct.
Absolutely. I'd love it if we can perhaps talk for a few moments about Ebrahim Golestan, an influential figure in the film and literature space during the life of Forough, and of course after, but he was Forugh Farrokhzad's lover. We talked about him throughout the conversation, but could you please capture the influence that he had in many ways on Foroug's work?
Of course, with great pleasure. A lot has been written, said about this relationship. So let me not talk about what has been said about the relationship, and instead focus on what Forough and Mr. Golestan have said about the relationship. And I will end it with what I think this relationship has done to both of them. If we read the poems of Tavalludi Digar and of Let Us Believe in the Dawn of a Cold Season, we will see that this relationship is unique in Iranian literature. And we have a glorious literature of 1100 years. Many have compared it to the relationship of Rumi and Shams. I think there is something to say about that. I think this relationship was constructive for both of them. Chinese people have an expression that I really enjoy. They say, we never swim in the same water twice. And it's true. Of course, two people who had such a loving, tumultuous relationship, a relationship of two minds, a relationship of two intellectuals, have been impacted by this relationship. Forough herself, in her poems, tells us how she was impacted by this relationship. She has offered her last poetry collection to Ebrahim Golestan. She has written many poems in which she calls her different, unique, in which she basically says, you've made me the poet I am. Now, I don't subscribe to that. Forugh Farrokhzad was a unique poet before she even met Mr. Golestan. And I have great respect for Mr. Golestan. But the relationship, those 8 years, were of course instrumental in both of them becoming better writers, better poets, better cinematographers. You know, 15 of Farrokhzad's letters to Mr. Golestan are published in the literary biography of Forough Farrokhzad with unpublished letters. If you carefully read those letters, you will see that in 15 letters, she is discussing over 60, and I repeat, over 60 films that she has seen in her travels in Europe with Mr. Golestan. She talks about writers, she writes about new trends in avant-garde art, she talks about directors, and she talks about so many films. What an amazing relationship, not only of two bodies, but also of two minds, of two intellects, of two people who shared a similar view of the world.
Dr. Milani, could you recommend perhaps some of Faroukh's poetry, or perhaps a book or collection, to our audience and viewers who may not be as familiar with Faroukh's work, or are, as one question says, recently getting acclimated with her poetry? What would you recommend?
Faroukh has written only about 130 poems. Not all of them, unfortunately, have been translated. In fact, one of her most important collection, Osyan, or Esyan, as some people would prefer to pronounce it, has not even, not even 1/3 of those poems have been translated. Mm-hmm. So first of all, I hope more of her poems will be translated. Two, there are many different translations of her poems. There is a recent one. My suggestion is that please, go to your libraries and order these different translations. We really need to support our women writers and poets. I have now, as you kindly referred to, the great honor to be an external expert for the Nobel Committee. And it has been an eye-opening experience to me. What are the chances of our Iranian women writers and poets to be nominated if we don't start spending resources, our time and energy in translating their works, in making a bridge between what these women, wonderful artists that they are, between them and the world at large.
Absolutely. And that is so well said, and I very much resonate those sentiments. I want to thank you, Dr. Milani, for your time, for your expertise, knowledge, but more so your passion and empathy on our culture, literature, history, and women. I want to salute you. I want to salute Forugh Farrokhzad and the many women and girls in Iran whose voice should be amplified. And I want to close my thoughts and would pass it to the organizers of the event. You mentioned Nobel, and one of my favorite writers, Kazuo Ishiguro, he wrote in his speech while receiving the prize, he said, storytelling, I'm paraphrasing, essentially storytelling is someone telling another, this is how I feel. Do you feel that? This is what I see. Do you see that? So thank you for allowing us the time to see, feel, and hear some of what Forugh had to say to her community and society and to the world. Thank you so much.
It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Milani and Ms. Kangarloo. On behalf of Professor Mustafi and the Persian Studies program, I want to thank everyone who joined us today and for your questions. For your information, the webinar is recorded and it will be available on our website, as I put it in the chat, in the next few weeks. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. خدا نگهدار. روز خیلی خوبی داشته باشید. خداحافظ.